Clara Jenkins leaned her entire body weight against the heavy oak door of her grandfather's secluded cabin, forcing it shut against the howling winds of the Keweenaw Peninsula. Outside, the brutal Michigan winter had transformed Lake Superior into a desolate expanse of jagged, groaning ice. It was January, and the temperature had plummeted to a bitter 14 degrees below zero. Clara had retreated to this isolated corner of the world to disappear, hoping the deep freeze might numb the agonizing reality of her ruined life. 6 months earlier, Clara's world had violently fractured. Her ex-husband, Dylan Harding, a charismatic but profoundly manipulative investment broker, had vanished, leaving behind a mountain of concealed debt, a trail of shattered investors, and a frozen bank account in Clara's name. The federal investigators had cleared her of criminal wrongdoing, but the financial and emotional devastation was absolute. The cabin, a dilapidated heirloom passed down through her mother's family, was the only asset Dylan hadn't managed to liquidate. Shivering, Clara pulled her thick wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The wood stove was dying, reduced to glowing orange embers that offered little defiance against the creeping chill. She needed more firewood from the shed near the shoreline, a chore she dreaded but couldn't avoid. Pulling on her heavy boots, a thick parka, and insulated gloves, she braced herself and stepped back out into the maelstrom. The wind whipped her face with microscopic shards of ice, stinging her cheeks as she trudged through the knee-deep snow. As she neared the frozen shoreline, the rhythmic crashing of the icy waves against the shelf was deafening. She loaded her arms with split oak logs from the shed and turned to head back. That was when she saw it. About 50 yards away, out on a perilous, unstable shelf of ice, something was thrashing. Through the blinding white squall, it looked like a crumpled heap of snow, but snow didn't flap erratically or leave a stark crimson stain on the ice. Clara dropped the firewood. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she cautiously stepped onto the frozen lake. The ice groaned beneath her boots, a deep, resonant cracking sound that warned of the lethal, freezing water just inches below. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a magnificent, heartbreaking sight. It was a massive, snowy owl. Its pristine white feathers were matted with freezing blood, and one of its massive wings hung at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Worse, the bird's left talon was completely encased in a thick crust of black ice, anchoring the creature to the frozen lake. It had likely dived for prey in the open water, misjudged the freezing spray, and become hopelessly trapped. It was exhausted, its movements sluggish and desperate. It was dying. Clara fell to her knees, ignoring the agonizing cold seeping through her snow pants. The owl snapped its beak at her, a sharp, clicking sound of terror and defiance, and fixed her with huge, piercing golden eyes. There was a profound, ancient wildness in that gaze, but also a rapidly fading light. "Shh," Clara whispered, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise." She knew that touching a wild raptor was incredibly dangerous, but leaving it meant certain death. Clara stripped off her heavy parka, braving the lethal wind in only her sweater, and gently draped the thick coat over the terrified bird. The sudden darkness calmed the owl. Working entirely by touch, Clara slid her gloved hands under the coat, locating the trapped talon. She used the heavy brass buckle of her winter boot to furiously chip away at the ice. Minutes bled away. Clara's fingers went entirely numb, and her teeth chattered so violently her jaw ached, but she refused to stop. Finally, with a sharp crack, the ice gave way. Clara scooped the heavy, blanketed bundle into her arms and ran. She stumbled blindly through the snowdrift, her lungs burning, until she practically kicked the cabin door open and collapsed onto the braided rug inside. For the next 3 hours, the cabin transformed into a makeshift triage center. Clara stoked the fire until the room was sweltering. She dialed the only local veterinarian willing to make house calls in Copper Harbor, Dr. Arthur George. Arthur, a gruff but deeply compassionate man in his late 60s, guided her over a crackling landline. Following his instructions, she carefully secured the owl's deadly talons with thick leather welding gloves, cleaned the superficial lacerations on its chest with warm saline, and immobilized the dislocated wing with self-adhering bandages from her first aid kit. Throughout the painful ordeal, the owl, which she spontaneously named Boreas, after the Greek god of the north wind, remained eerily still. its golden eyes never leaving her face. Doctor, George managed to reach the cabin 2 days later in his modified snowcat. After a thorough examination, he was astounded. The dislocation is severe, Clara, and the frostbite on the talon is nasty, Arthur muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Most wild birds simply succumb to the shock of an ordeal like this. But this old boy, he's a fighter. He'll need weeks of rehabilitation in a warm, quiet environment. Are you up for this? Clara looked at the magnificent creature resting in the large dog crate Arthur had brought. I have nowhere else to be, she said quietly. The next 6 weeks became a rhythm of quiet healing. Clara built a large, padded enclosure in her spare bedroom. She fed Boreas raw meat procured from the local butcher, administered antibiotics, and sat for hours reading aloud to him so he would acclimate to her voice. A silent, profound bond formed between the shattered woman and the broken bird. In the stillness of the cabin, Clara found her own mind quieting. The panic attacks that had plagued her since Dylan's betrayal began to recede. Caring for Boreas required a fierce, present focus that left no room for the ghosts of her past. She was healing him, but Boreas was unquestionably saving her. By late February, the wing had healed remarkably well. Boreas was growing restless, hopping energetically around the spare room, his powerful wings testing the air. Clara knew the time to release him was rapidly approaching, a realization that brought a heavy, melancholic ache to her chest. Then, on a bleak Tuesday afternoon, the fragile sanctuary Clara had built was shattered. The roar of an engine cut through the silence, followed by the aggressive slamming of a truck door. Clara looked out the frosted window and felt all the blood drain from her face. Striding up the pathway, looking disheveled, desperate, and furious, was Dylan. Before she could lock the door, he had pushed it open, bringing a blast of freezing wind with him. "Hello, Clara," Dylan sneered, his charm entirely replaced by a feral, hunted desperation. His designer coat was stained, and he looked thinner, exhausted. "Get out, Dylan. You aren't supposed to know where I am." "I'm calling the police," Clara said, her voice trembling as she backed toward the kitchen counter where her phone lay. Dylan lunged, snatching the phone from her hand and smashing it against the floorboards. "You're not calling anyone," he barked. "The feds froze my offshore accounts. I have nothing, Clara, nothing, except this cabin. It's still marital property. And I have a buyer lined up in Marquette who will pay cash today. I have the quitclaim deed right here. You are going to sign it." He pulled a crumpled stack of legal papers and a heavy silver pen from his pocket, slamming them onto the wooden dining table. When he pulled his hand away, a heavy silver keychain clattered onto the wood, attached to a thick, encrypted USB drive. Clara recognized it immediately. It was the drive Dylan used to brag about, the one that held the real ledgers of his illicit shell companies, the very evidence the FBI had scoured their penthouse for and failed to find. "I won't sign it," Clara said, finding a well of courage she didn't know she possessed. "This cabin was my grandfather's. You ruined my life, Dylan. You don't get to take my home, too." Dylan's face twisted with rage. "You stupid, stubborn woman," he hissed. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, grabbing Clara roughly by the shoulders and shoving her hard against the wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. "You are going to sign this, or I swear to God I will leave you bleeding out in this frozen wasteland, and no one will find you until the spring thaw." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the blow. A deafening, unearthly screech shattered the room. The heavy oak door to the spare bedroom, which Clara had left slightly ajar, flew open. A massive shadow eclipsed the ambient light of the cabin. Boreas, completely silent in flight despite his size, descended into the living room like an avenging angel of ice and snow. The owl didn't just attack. He struck with the calculated, terrifying precision of an apex predator defending its nest. With a wingspan of nearly 5 feet, Boreas hit Dylan squarely in the chest. 4-inch, razor-sharp talons, fully healed and lethal, sank deep into the expensive fabric of Dylan's coat and the flesh beneath. Dylan screamed a high, panicked sound of absolute terror. He released Clara instantly, flailing his arms to protect his face from the furious flurry of white feathers and snapping beak. Boreas beat his massive wings, buffeting Dylan relentlessly, his golden eyes blazing with primal fury. "Get it off! Get it off me!" Dylan shrieked, stumbling backward over the rug. He tripped over the coffee table and crashed heavily to the floor. Boreas immediately launched himself back into the air, banking off the ceiling beams, and prepared for a second dive. That was all it took. Dylan scrambled to his hands and knees, scrambling toward the front door like a panicked rat. He wrenched the door open and sprinted into the freezing snow, leaving a trail of blood from his shoulder. He threw himself into his truck, slammed the door, and tore down the snow-packed driveway, the engine roaring as he fled. Clara slid down the wall, trembling violently, gasping for air. Boreas landed gracefully on the back of the sofa. He ruffled his feathers, settled his wings, and let out a soft, low hoot. He looked at Clara, his golden eyes blinking slowly, a sign of deep trust. It was then Clara saw it. Lying on the floorboards, completely forgotten by Dylan in his blind panic, was the silver keychain and the encrypted USB drive. The twist of fate was so profound it stole her breath. Boreas hadn't just saved her from a physical assault. By terrifying Dylan into dropping the drive, the owl had just handed Clara the definitive proof of her ex-husband's embezzlement. That small piece of metal contained the key to clearing her massive IRS debts, restoring her ruined credit, and ensuring Dylan Harding would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. Clara picked up the drive, clutching it to her chest, and began to weep. They weren't tears of fear, but of an overwhelming, cathartic release. 2 days later, she handed the drive over to the FBI field office in Marquette. A week after that, Dylan was arrested trying to board a flight to Montreal. The nightmare was officially over. By late April, the brutal ice of Lake Superior finally began to fracture and melt, giving way to the deep, churning blue of the water. The snow retreated, revealing the resilient green moss of the Keweenaw woods. Boreas was fully rehabilitated, his strength entirely restored. Dr. George stood beside Clara on the back porch of the cabin, the heavy transport crate resting between them. "You know, Clara," Arthur said softly, watching the wind rustle the pines, "snowy owls are notoriously solitary and fiercely independent. They don't form bonds with humans. The fact that he protected you, it defies every book I've ever read on avian behavior. He recognized you as his flock." Clara smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. She knelt and unlatched the door to the crate. Boreas stepped out cautiously. He hopped onto the wooden railing of the porch and surveyed the vast, open sky. He turned his head, looking at Clara one last time. He didn't make a sound, but the connection between them vibrated in the crisp spring air. With a powerful thrust of his legs, he launched himself upward. His massive white wings caught the thermal drafts off the lake, and within seconds, he was a brilliant white speck against the azure sky, finally free. Clara thought that would be the end of the story. She spent the summer reclaiming her life, fixing up the cabin, and finding peace in the solitude she had once feared. Then came the morning in late October. The first frost had just kissed the pines, signaling the return of the bitter cold. Clara stepped onto her front porch with a mug of hot coffee. There, sitting perfectly centered on the wooden welcome mat, was a single, pristine white feather. It was undeniably from a snowy owl. Clara looked up. High in the branches of the ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing, sitting in quiet majesty, was Boreas. But he wasn't alone. Sitting on the branch beside him was a slightly larger, heavily barred female owl. He had brought his mate to show her the place where he had been saved. Boreas let out a soft, familiar clicking sound, a greeting carried on the freezing wind. He lingered for a moment longer before taking flight with his mate, disappearing into the dense, snowy canopy of the northern woods. Clara knelt and picked up the white feather. She held it against her cheek, the tears finally falling warm and freely as she realized the deepest truth of her survival. She had walked into the ice expecting to rescue a dying bird, never knowing that the bird was coming to rescue her.